The presidential election was decided Tuesday night in an outcome that surprised those who predicted it would be much closer. Political science professor Jerry Herbel joins us now to help us make sense of it all. Welcome, Dr. Herbel.
Thank you, Megan. Great to be here.
And first thing I wanted to talk to you about, or ask you about, is how do you feel about the Georgia college community and its involvement with the election?
Well, we try every year to bring events to campus that are going to help students understand the issues of the election so as to make up their own minds about how they would like to vote. I think this year was no exception to that general practice over the past, and I think the students, probably those who did vote, walked into the voting booth with a good understanding of what the issues were and knowing what they wanted to, how they wanted to cast their vote and what it meant.
Great. Well, we got some commentary on students and their opinions for the election. Let's take a look.
Disappointed, but overall I think I knew who was going to come out ahead, and I just hope that these next 4 years go well.
I was surprised and relieved, actually. Like, when I started watching the election, the electoral vote seemed in favor of Romney. But then out of nowhere, when Obama won Ohio, that was it. It was over.
And now we're back, so I wanted to ask you, why do you think it is that Obama had such a successful campaign?
Well, I think the main reason for the success of the Democrats overall this year was a better understanding of the changing nature of the electorate. In 2008, which was a historic election, African Americans and Hispanics accounted for 18% of the electorate. This year they accounted for 23% of the electorate. So that very high unprecedented number in 2008 actually increased in 2012. Democrats correctly read that change and Republicans did not. And I think President Obama tailored his message much more effectively to those elements of the electorate, and it gave him such an advantage that Romney was forced to have to win 2/3 of white voters in order to overcome that nearly 3-to-1 advantage over the minority voters that voted for President Obama. He nearly did, but the numbers are just too high to overcome, and so I think this is a real challenge for Republicans going forward to figure out how to adjust their message and tailor it and tailor their policies in a way that's going to appeal to those voters.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Do you think that maybe the Republicans didn't pick the right candidate, or what about Romney's campaign was not shedding as positive a light as Obama's?
Well, I think Governor Romney was the best candidate that was on the slate of potential candidates this year on the Republican side. I mean, I think we would maybe have seen a different type of candidate if Republicans had a broader field to choose from. But if you'll recall, the Republican primary election this year was extremely hotly contested. And that contest, I think, in a sense, consumed so much time and money on the Republican side that Romney came out of that process a weakened candidate, in a sense not as prepared for the general election as he maybe would have been under normal conditions. So I think that led to the perception that Romney was a weaker candidate, when really I think it was just the fact that he had to again spend so much money and so much time through April locking up the nomination.
Right. So on the topic of financial, do you think that had a lot to do with the campaigns individually with Romney and Obama? Do you think Obama may have had more support financially and that helped with his election?
Not really. I mean, I think this year there was rough parity between the two parties and the amount of money they had to spend, mostly because of the incredible amount of money raised by these super PACs, right. Which were allowed to spend campaign money up to essentially Election Day. So both sides essentially, through their own campaigns and through their super PACs, spent about $1 billion each. So roughly $2 billion expended in total on election activities. And I think there was no real advantage to one side or the other on that basis.
Okay, and also, I guess, what now is what we need to talk about. You know, the January 1st is coming up, and for those who know, the fiscal cliff is upon us. What do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, on the surface, there's been no real change. I mean, Democrats still control the Senate, Republicans still control the House of Representatives in roughly the same proportion, and President Obama is still president. However, I think there's a growing sense that there may be some kind of a mandate for President Obama to suggest tax increases that Republicans are going to agree with this time around that they did not agree with in 2011, the first time that the debt ceiling agreement was approached. And so I think we're likely to see an agreement made before the fiscal cliff happens. I think it's likely to be in a way that's going to be more favorable to Democrat interests than Republican interests. And this probably is the main change that we're going to notice immediately from the election, even though the numbers turn out to be pretty much the same as they had been.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the friction that happened with John Boehner and President Obama, do you think that that friction is still present, or they've worked out their issues? Because there was a plan that was on the table and then fell through, and then that kind of created the friction. So do you think that they've come to an agreement? I know that in MSNBC they told us that they spoke on the phone yesterday.
Right, and I think that says something right there. I mean, their relationship is famously icy. And so for them to have a phone conversation now becomes a news story.
Right.
I think there's likely to not be much change in their personal feelings toward each other, but I think the calculation politically has changed. And so, again, as I said, I think the Republicans are more likely to agree to some things that they would not have agreed to a year ago or even 6 months ago.
What do you think about the not the tax cuts, but the cuts in funding for all of the departments? Do you think that there's going to be a lot of cuts, or less than the fiscal cliff is claiming there will be?
The fiscal cliff, so-called fiscal cliff, is an agreement that was reached pursuant again to the extending the debt ceiling in 2011. It called for automatic, essentially across-the-board cuts in discretionary spending.
Right.
Those cuts will happen according to a process called sequestration. That process, I think, is going to be avoided because of the agreement that is likely to, again, to be reached now that wouldn't have been, I think, reached if, let's say, Romney had won. So I think because of the outcome of the election, that sequestration process will probably not happen, which probably also means that there will be less spending cuts as a result of this agreement than there would have been under a different outcome of the election. So given all of that, I think the probability is, and most economists are looking for relatively high federal budget deficits for the foreseeable future, and until there is real solid GDP growth, that situation is not going to change.
All right, well, great. That's been very insightful. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you for having me.